The hum of the air conditioning was the first thing that crawled under my skin. Cold, mechanical, relentless. It filled the silence like a third person in the room, whispering a reminder that this wasn't a conversation, it was an execution. I sat in the middle of a polished wooden table that stretched far too wide for comfort. On the other side, Martin Hale leaned forward, elbows on the surface, hands folded as if he were a benevolent priest delivering bad news to a sinner. Beside him, Deanna from HR had the face of a marble statue, perfectly expressionless as she slid a stack of papers across to me. "We believe you've been falsifying reports, Valerie. The numbers don't match." Her voice was sharp, metallic. The kind of voice that didn't ask questions, it only closed doors. I stared down at the papers, my name in bold at the top. Beneath it, lines of accusations dressed up in corporate language. Termination, non-disclosure, severance. The neat promise of 2 weeks, pay in exchange for my silence. 6 years. 6 years of arriving before the lights were even switched on, of walking out when the cleaners had already begun vacuuming the hallways. 6 years of weekends sacrificed, family gatherings missed, friendships dissolved under the weight of deadlines and endless client calls. All of it condensed into a few sterile paragraphs, as if my entire career could be erased with a single pen stroke. Martin cleared his throat. "Valerie, we want to make this transition as smooth as possible. If you cooperate, we can avoid making this messy." His voice carried the kind of fake sympathy I had grown used to in corporate offices. The sound of someone who has already decided your fate but wants to look kind while they hand it to you. I should have been angry. I should have been terrified. In truth, I felt strangely still, as if my heart had slowed instead of raced. I watched his lips move, watched Deanna set an expensive pen beside the termination form, watched her lean back as though this was just another routine meeting. That was when I smiled. "Before I sign anything," I said, my tone calm, almost light, "I want to show you something." Both their faces flickered. Just for a second, Martin's mask of control cracked. His eyes narrowed. Deanna tilted her head as if trying to calculate whether this was resistance or madness. I reached for my phone, sliding it from my bag with the same casualness one might use to pull out a lipstick. I unlocked it, scrolled through my files, and then turned the screen toward them. 3 months ago, I began noticing discrepancies, I said. The reports I submitted didn't match what appeared later in the system. At first, I assumed it was a glitch. But then it kept happening. Martin shifted in his chair. He adjusted his tie. A bead of sweat appeared near his temple, though the room was cold enough to make my fingers stiff. "I have a habit," I continued, "of blind copying all my daily reports to a private archive, just for my own record." A nervous smile ghosted across my lips. "Call it paranoia." That word landed like a pebble tossed into still water. Deanna's brows arched. "That's a violation of company policy. Section 4.3, I finished for her." "Yes, I know. But it has an exception, personal work logs for performance reviews." I checked with legal when I started. I tapped my screen again, and a spreadsheet filled with dates, numbers, and notes appeared. "This," I said, "is a record of every alteration made to my submitted reports for the last 8 months. Look closely." I pushed the phone toward them. Deanna hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled, barely perceptible. Martin kept his eyes on me, as though staring hard enough might break my confidence. "It's funny," I said. "My client acquisitions always dropped by about 17%, consistently. And Ethan Cole? Well, his rose by about the same amount." I let the words hang in the air. Martin's jaw clenched. "Coincidence," I asked softly, "that this started happening right after you took over our division? Or that every single woman in our department has similar discrepancies while none of the men do?" Silence. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt louder. "I should tell you something," I added, leaning back. "My mother was a nurse. She lost her career because someone tampered with her records. She had no proof. I promised myself I'd never let that happen to me." Deanna's eyes finally flicked up from the phone. For the first time since the meeting began, her professional mask faltered. Martin looked pale, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. I could have stopped there. I could have savored the fear settling into their expressions. But this wasn't about fear. It was about truth. I opened another file. This one showed system logins, times, dates, credentials. Every alteration was made between 7:15 and 7:40 in the evening, I explained. Always on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Always using your admin login, Martin, right around the same time you told the team you were staying late for system maintenance. The silence that followed was no longer heavy, it was suffocating. Martin tried to laugh. A short, brittle sound that cracked in the middle. You cannot prove this, Valerie, but I already have. I slid a small USB drive from my bag and placed it on the table. The metal clinked softly against the polished wood, louder than any word spoken. Inside is everything. Screenshots of my original reports, copies of the altered ones, system logs, a full timeline analysis. I sent it all to the ethics office and to legal 30 minutes ago. For the first time, Martin's eyes dropped to the table. Deanna inhaled sharply, her throat tight with something close to panic. I didn't come here today to be fired, I said calmly. I came here to see how far you'd try to push me. The door opened before either of them could respond. Arthur from legal stepped in, his face set in grim lines, a folder clutched in his hand. Behind him, Marissa from ethics followed, her assistant carrying a laptop, already typing. What's going on here? Arthur asked, his voice flat. I leaned back in my chair, letting the storm unfold around me. It wasn't just about saving myself anymore. It was about showing them I was not afraid. For 2 hours, I sat in that room as questions ricocheted like bullets. Arthur flipped through documents. Marissa asked me to walk them through my timeline. The assistant projected spreadsheets onto the screen, pointing out the patterns that matched exactly what I had claimed. Martin tried to speak, but every word tangled itself in contradictions. Deanna kept her lips pressed shut, her eyes darting from one face to another like a trapped animal searching for an exit. How did you notice the discrepancies? Arthur asked finally, adjusting his glasses. I keep a personal work journal, I answered. Every client, every interaction, every number. When my quarterly reviews didn't match what I knew I had achieved, I started digging. Marissa leaned forward. And you believe this wasn't just an accident? I looked directly at her. It wasn't just me, Tanya in healthcare accounts, Zoe in retirement services, Imani in estate planning, Rebecca in commercial lending. All of them had their performance altered after Martin took over. All of them women, none of the men. The room fell silent again. The air conditioner hummed, indifferent to the chaos it chilled. The regional director joined by video call, his weekend clearly interrupted. His face appeared on the screen, tired but sharp. Miss Ray, he said, we will launch a full investigation immediately. On behalf of the company, I want to apologize. I smiled faintly. I had heard those words before. Investigation, apology, promises. I knew how easily they could dissolve into settlements and silence. I appreciate that, I replied carefully. But I should also mention the financial impact. My bonuses for the past 3 quarters, tied directly to the metrics that were altered, add up to approximately $47,000. Multiply that by the other women affected, and you are looking at gender-based compensation discrimination. Something I imagine regulators, and perhaps the press, would find interesting. Arthur's pen stilled mid-note. Marissa's assistant typed even faster. Martin's face was ashen, his hands shaking where they rested on the table. We should continue this with the executive team only, Arthur said quietly. Deanna and Martin were asked to leave. As Martin stood, I caught his eyes. The man who had stolen credit for my work, who had manipulated numbers to build his own power, who had expected me to fold quietly. He looked away first. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine. The city lights shimmered in the distance. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, whispers of what had happened spreading faster than wildfire. I answered none of them. For the first time in years, I felt still. Not victorious, not relieved, just still, as if my entire body had been holding its breath for 6 years and had finally exhaled. And yet, I knew this was not the end. This was the beginning of something larger. A storm had started, and I was standing at the eye of it. The next morning, security met me in the lobby. My pulse jumped. I thought perhaps they had decided to remove me after all. But instead, they escorted me to the executive floor, a place I had only visited twice before. Lorraine Templeton, the CEO herself, was waiting in her office. Her space was nothing like the ornate rooms of the other executives. No mahogany desks, no walls cluttered with awards. Just clean lines, practical furniture, and the sharp eyes of a woman who had built something from the ground up. Miss Ray, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. I spent the weekend reviewing your evidence. It is compelling. I sat without speaking. Waiting. I built this company to be different, she continued, to value results over politics, to reward performance over connections. Clearly, I failed to ensure those values reached every corner. With respect, I said softly, values without enforcement are just decorations. For the first time, Lorraine smiled. A real one. That is exactly why I wanted to speak with you. Martin Hale has been terminated, Deanna suspended. Ethan Cole's promotion is under review. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents offering back pay for lost bonuses, a promotion to Director of Client Strategy, and a position on a new committee for compensation review. I glanced at the numbers. They were higher than I expected. Far higher. Why not just pay me to disappear, I asked. It would be cheaper. Lorraine's gaze sharpened. Because that's what Martin would do. I do not want to bury this. I want you to help me expose it, fix it, eliminate it. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe fully. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a much bigger one. When I walked out of Lorraine Templeton's office that morning, the city outside the glass towers looked different. Sharper somehow, edges gleaming in the pale sunlight. People moved along the sidewalks with coffees in their hands, phones pressed to their ears, eyes darting between traffic lights and schedules. To them, the world spun as usual. To me, everything had tilted. I wasn't the woman they had tried to erase anymore. I wasn't the expendable employee they expected to leave quietly. Now I was something else. The promotion was official within a week. My name appeared on the new directory, Director of Client Strategy. My inbox filled with congratulations, some sincere, others perfunctory. In the cafeteria, people looked at me differently, curious, wary, calculating. Some smiled too brightly. Others avoided my eyes altogether, as if I carried a contagious virus called truth. I kept my head down and worked, or at least that was how it appeared. In reality, I was building something far larger. Lorraine's words echoed in my mind. I want you empowered to help me find every instance of this behavior in our company and eliminate it. That was both a mission and a warning. The first time I sat at my new desk, on the executive floor where the carpets muffled every footstep, I opened my private archive. Years of carefully stored emails, reports, notes. Each folder a tiny fortress of proof. I felt the weight of them, the way other people might feel the weight of a gun tucked into their coat. I wasn't here to carry a weapon. I was here to use it. It started with Tanya from Healthcare Accounts. She knocked on my door one afternoon, her voice low as she asked if she could have a word. She sat across from me, her hands twisting the strap of her bag, and confessed what I already suspected. My numbers never matched, she whispered. I thought I was going crazy. I worked harder than ever, but every quarter my performance review said I was slipping. I slid a sheet across to her. A chart with her original submissions compared to the altered ones. The color drained from her face. You kept this? She asked. For months, I said. You're not alone. She exhaled, shaky, like someone surfacing from deep underwater. That became the pattern. Zoe in retirement services, Imani in estate planning, Rebecca in commercial lending. Each woman came with the same haunted expression, the same story of invisible sabotage. And for each of them, I had records. This was the twist, the truth buried under years of silence. It wasn't just me. Martin Hale hadn't only tried to bury Valerie Ray, he had buried an entire group of women whose success threatened his order of things. The more I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't personal. It was systemic. Late at night, I sat at my desk while the city glowed beneath me, piecing together patterns. I saw how numbers shifted in parallel, always down for the women, always up for favored men. I mapped it on charts, red lines plunging while blue lines rose. I thought of my mother, her evaluations rewritten by a man who wanted her silence. I thought of Tanya's eyes when she saw her stolen achievements returned to her on paper. And I thought of Martin Hale, who now sat at home somewhere, plotting how to claw his way back. This wasn't over. It had only grown teeth. The first major test came 2 weeks later. We had a pitch for the Whitmore account, one of the biggest in our pipeline. The kind of client that could bring millions in annual revenue. I was scheduled to present. I worked on that presentation for nights, running simulations, customizing strategies, polishing every slide until it gleamed. The morning of the pitch, I walked into the boardroom with confidence threading through my veins, and then I opened the file. My slides were wrong, not just slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. Numbers scrambled, projections miscalculated, specific references stripped away. For a second, my blood froze. This was sabotage. Someone had tampered with my work, but panic didn't take me. Preparation did. I called IT security immediately, my voice steady. Within minutes, they traced the edits. Lucas, a colleague whose smile had always carried too much sharpness. He had accessed the file at 11:42 p.m., hours after I left, using his credentials. Every change logged, every keystroke recorded. By the time Lucas strolled into the office at 8:30 a.m., I was waiting with Arthur from legal and Rita from IT security. Interesting late-night work you did, I said softly. His face drained of color as Rita laid out the evidence. Arthur's tone was ice. "You have 30 minutes to clear your desk. Security will escort you out." Lucas sputtered, rage and disbelief colliding. "This isn't over, Valerie. People like you don't last long. You think you're winning, but you've just painted a target on your back." He stormed out, but his words stayed with me, because deep down I knew he was right. Lucas's words echoed long after he was gone. People like you don't last long. He wasn't wrong. That afternoon, whispers ran faster than emails. By the time I stepped into the cafeteria, conversations hushed mid-sentence. A group of analysts at the corner table shifted their eyes to their coffee cups as I passed. Two senior managers laughed too loudly about something unrelated, but their glances lingered on me. I had become radioactive. When you take down someone from within, people don't always cheer. They calculate. They wonder if you will turn your gaze on them next. And some decide that you are more dangerous than the corrupt system you exposed. That night, as I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirrored walls. My hair was pulled back tightly, my face pale under the fluorescent light, eyes sharp. Not the woman I had been 6 months ago. She would have smiled politely, bowed her head, worked harder in silence. That woman was gone. The storm was gathering. The next week proved it. During a meeting with potential investors, I noticed one of the senior partners cutting me off mid-sentence, redirecting the conversation to my male colleague, despite the fact that the data he repeated came from my own analysis. The investors smiled politely, but their eyes flicked back to me. They always saw. Later that day in the elevator, the same partner leaned close and whispered, "Be careful, Valerie. Nobody likes a crusader." The word clung to me like a stain, crusader, as if demanding fairness, demanding honesty was some reckless religious war instead of common decency. I went home that night and poured a glass of wine, standing on my balcony while the city pulsed beneath me. Was I reckless? Was I dragging the company into chaos just to prove a point? Had I become so obsessed with exposing the rot that I was willing to burn the whole house down? Doubt is a cruel guest. It moves into your chest quietly, rearranges the furniture, and whispers that maybe you are the problem after all. But then I thought of Tanya, of Zoe, of Rebecca, of every woman whose hard work had been buried. I thought of my mother, crying at the kitchen table years ago with her career in ruins because no one believed her, and I remembered why I couldn't back down. 2 weeks later, the numbers told the story better than I could. The Whitmore account, despite Lucas's sabotage, had signed with us after I salvaged the presentation in record time. But other clients had quietly pulled away. The stock price slipped. In the executive meetings, I could feel the unease like a hairline crack spreading across the table between us. Lorraine stayed firm in public, but in private, she pulled me aside. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said. "The old guard is fighting back. They're leaking rumors to competitors. They're whispering to the board that your reforms will destroy us." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. She placed a hand on the folder in front of her. "You did the right thing, Valerie, but right things have costs." "You ready for that?" I wanted to say yes without hesitation. Instead, I said nothing. The costs showed up in small ways. Colleagues stopped inviting me to after-work drinks. Some emails came late or not at all, as if my projects had slipped down their list of priorities. I caught men in the hall watching me with narrowed eyes, their voices lowering when I approached. But there were moments of light, too. Tanya sent me a note that read simply, "I almost quit last year. You made me believe in myself again." Zoe stopped by my office with a smile I hadn't seen on her face before. Rebecca emailed late one night, "Whatever happens, you are not alone." Those reminders were fuel. Quiet, steady fuel for a fire I wasn't ready to let die. Then came the board review. I sat in a glass-walled room with 10 directors staring down at quarterly reports that showed dips in client retention and rising whispers of instability. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't tell the whole truth either. One director leaned forward. "Perhaps, Ms. Ray, in your zeal to ensure transparency, you've disrupted the stability that brought us success in the first place." Zeal, crusader, reckless. The words stacked up like bricks around me, an invisible cage they hoped would contain me. I met his gaze and replied quietly, "Perhaps success built on silence isn't success at all." The room went still. I left the meeting with no applause, no handshakes, just the weight of uncertainty pressing on my shoulders. That night, I walked the streets of London until my feet ached. Neon lights blurred in the rain, voices of strangers rising and falling like distant waves. I felt both invisible and exposed, like a ghost wandering a city that didn't know what to do with me. When I finally returned home, I sat at my desk and opened the files again. Every chart, every email, every record of tampered data. I wasn't just holding evidence of sabotage. I was holding a map of power itself, one that revealed exactly who had been pulling strings and who had been left behind. It struck me then, the real danger was Martin Hale. He was already gone. The danger was the network that allowed him to thrive, the colleagues who benefited, the executives who looked away. This was bigger than one man, bigger than me. I closed my laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The unveiling had begun. But the war, that was only waiting for me on the other side of dawn. The war didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence. Silence when I walked into the cafeteria and conversations abruptly stopped. Silence in meetings when colleagues shifted their eyes away from me, as though my presence was a shadow across their notes. Silence in the hallways where once there had been casual laughter and invitations to after-work drinks. I learned that silence can be louder than any insult. First, I tried to brush it off. I buried myself in work, preparing presentations, restructuring accounts, analyzing client strategies until the numbers blurred on the screen. But silence has a way of multiplying. It seeps into your skin, your bones, until even the sound of your own footsteps feels like an intrusion. And then came the whispers. They floated through the office like smoke. Valerie only got promoted because she threatened to sue. Valerie is playing the victim. Valerie is dangerous. Valerie will destroy this company just to prove she's right. It didn't matter that none of it was true. In a place where perception is currency, whispers can bankrupt you faster than any balance sheet. One afternoon, I was in the elevator when two analysts from another department entered mid-conversation. They froze when they saw me, but not fast enough. "She's only there because the CEO pities her," one of them said before biting down on his lip. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The weight of their guilt filled the elevator like steam until the doors opened and they rushed out, leaving me alone with the metallic taste of their words. I knew this wasn't random. Someone was feeding those whispers, stoking them like embers into flame. And I had a very good idea who. Noah Turner, senior trader. Charismatic, connected, untouchable in his own mind. He had always been one of Martin Hale's allies, a man who thrived in the old system of favors and hidden deals. He smiled too widely whenever he saw me, the kind of smile that said, "You may have won one battle, but I'm still here." It was Noah who cornered me in the break room one morning, when the hum of the coffee machine drowned out the world. "Your little justice crusade has turned this place into a surveillance state," he said, voice low, words dripping with venom. "Some of us were doing just fine before you decided to play watchdog." I met his gaze, my own voice calm. "Transparency isn't surveillance. It's accountability," he smirked. "Easy for you to say when you're the one pulling the strings. Word is you're just currying favor with Lorraine to fast-track your career." The sting landed, sharp and unexpected. I kept my face neutral, though heat burned in my chest. "The system treats everyone equally," I said. "If you're doing your job well, you have nothing to worry about." Noah leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee. "You've made enemies, Valerie, more than you know." And then he walked out, leaving the words like a stain on the air. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed his tone, his smirk, the casual certainty in his voice. Enemies, more than you know. How many of them were waiting for me to stumble? How many were already plotting? The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, we had the Jenkins account presentation, a pitch that could reshape our revenue forecasts for the year. I had worked on it for weeks, tailoring every proposal, running scenario after scenario until the model was airtight. The morning of the pitch, I opened the file to review one last time. My stomach dropped. The numbers were wrong, catastrophically wrong. Revenue projections reversed. Client data mismatched. Charts broken. Sabotage, again. For a split second, panic pressed against my chest. The Jenkins team was scheduled to arrive in 2 hours. I couldn't rebuild everything from scratch. Then I remembered the new system. Every change tracked, every access logged. I called it immediately. Rita answered calm as ever. Within minutes, she traced the access. Timestamp, 11:42 p.m. the night before. Credentials, Noah Turner. I almost laughed at the predictability. When Noah strolled into the office that morning, his suit crisp, his smile smug, he found me waiting. Beside me stood Arthur from legal and Rita from IT security. "Busy night?" I asked casually. The smile cracked. Rita laid out the evidence with clinical precision. Every login, every edit, every false number. Arthur's tone left no room for argument. "This is corporate sabotage. You have 30 minutes to clean out your desk." For the first time, Noah's mask slipped. Rage twisted his face. "This isn't over, Valerie. You think you've won, but you've just painted a target on your back. People like you don't last in this industry." He stormed out with security at his heels. But his words, those stayed, because I knew he wasn't lying. Enemies, more than I knew. After Noah was escorted out of the building, a strange quiet lingered in the office. It wasn't relief. It wasn't justice. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. At first, I thought people would see the truth, that they'd understand Noah had tried to sabotage not me, but the company itself. That they'd realize I had only done what any loyal employee would do, protect the integrity of our work. But that's not how the story spread. By the end of the week, the whispers had returned darker now. She set him up. She wants to purge anyone who disagrees with her. She's building her empire by destroying others. Every hallway felt narrower, every meeting room heavier. When I spoke, some nodded politely, but their eyes flicked toward each other, measuring, calculating. It wasn't about no anymore. It was about me. The Jenkins pitch went forward despite everything. My team and I rebuilt the slides from backups, racing against the clock. We presented with barely controlled adrenaline, and somehow it was enough. Jenkins signed with us. A victory, on paper at least, but victories in this new world tasted hollow. Because a week later, 3 clients quietly withdrew their accounts. No explanations, just formal letters citing concerns about stability. Our stock price slipped further. Analysts questioned whether our leadership had become unstable. The board took notice. I sat in another glass-walled room, surrounded by directors flipping through reports. Their expressions were unreadable masks carved from stone. One cleared his throat. "Ms. Ray, while your efforts at transparency are commendable, the numbers show disruption, lost clients, declining stock value. We must ask whether your reforms have destabilized the very structure you sought to strengthen." His words hit like stones. Disruption, destabilized. The implication was clear. I wasn't fixing the company, I was breaking it. I forced myself to remain calm. "We haven't lost stability," I replied. "We've lost shadows, the kind of clients who thrive on the old ways. What we are building now is sustainable, honest." Silence, no nods, no agreement, just cold eyes and the scratching of pens against paper. When I left the room, my legs felt heavy. For the first time, I wondered if maybe they were right. That night, I sat in my apartment with the lights off, the city glowing beyond the window. My glass of wine sat untouched. I stared at my reflection, faint in the glass, and asked myself questions I didn't want to hear. Had I gone too far? Was I so obsessed with exposing injustice that I had blinded myself to the damage it caused? Was I turning into the very thing I despised? A tyrant convinced her way was the only way? Doubt whispered louder than any boardroom. The next morning, Tanya appeared at my office. She carried a thin folder, her expression unreadable. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. I nodded, too tired to pretend. "We lost 3 clients, maybe more to come. The board," I trailed off, unable to finish. She placed the folder on my desk. "Before you drown in guilt, look at this." Inside were numbers, growth charts, gains in healthcare accounts her division. 12 new clients in the past month, steady upward lines. I frowned. "How?" Tanya smiled, small but fierce. "Because of you, word is spreading. Clients who care about fairness, about integrity, are coming to us. Women with portfolios they've built from nothing. Families who want honesty. They're moving their business here because of what you're building." Her words cut through the fog in my mind like a lighthouse in a storm. Not everyone wanted me gone. Not everyone believed the whispers. Some saw the truth, some valued it. "Valerie," Tanya said softly, "you've changed the game. And yes, that makes enemies, but it also makes allies. You just have to remember which voices matter." When she left, I stared at the folder, tracing the upward lines with my fingertip. Maybe the board couldn't see it yet. Maybe the old guard refused to. But change was happening whether they liked it or not. And I realized then, the silent war wasn't just theirs. It was mine too. I wasn't here to survive anymore. I was here to win. The first sign of the cost was subtle. Emails that used to include me now went out without my name. Meetings I should have been invited to were held behind closed doors. Colleagues who once came to me with questions suddenly had their answers elsewhere. Isolation doesn't arrive with a bang. It creeps in, slow and patient, until one day you realize the circle around you has vanished. I walked the halls of the company I had given 6 years of my life to and felt like a stranger. My office, larger now than it had ever been, felt like a glass cage. I could see everything, but the walls were too thick for sound to pass through. The board's unease grew louder. Reports of lost clients piled on their desks. The whispers reached their ears, polished into arguments about Valerie's instability, her disruptive methods, her crusade against the culture that made us successful. I had become a problem to be managed, not a leader to be trusted. One director didn't bother hiding his disdain. After a tense presentation on new accountability metrics, he leaned back and said, "You seem more interested in rewriting our history than in building our future." I smiled tightly, though my stomach churned. The two aren't separate. You can't build a future on a broken foundation. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence carried the weight of dismissal. The pressure followed me home. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering if I had gone too far. Doubt gnawed at me like rats in the dark. Was I becoming the villain of my own story? I thought of my mother often during those nights. I saw her at the kitchen table years ago, papers spread before her, her career crumbling while she insisted she had done nothing wrong. She had looked so small, so tired. I remembered promising myself I'd never end up like that. And yet here I was, sitting alone in my apartment, the city lights mocking me with their indifference. One evening, I received a message from an old colleague I trusted. It was short, blunt. "They're planning to push you out, Valerie. Maybe not this month, maybe not next. But it's coming, be ready." I stared at those words until my eyes blurred. Push me out. Like I was an infection they could cut away. I knew he was right. But here's the thing about being pushed. Sometimes it gives you momentum you didn't know you had. I doubled down. I poured myself into the new accountability system Lorraine had asked me to design. It wasn't just numbers anymore, it was a lifeline. I envisioned a database that couldn't be altered without leaving a trace, a system that made manipulation impossible. Blockchain-style entries, automatic alerts to employees when their data changed, quarterly audits to identify patterns. If the company wanted to push me out, fine, but I would leave behind something they couldn't erase. Still, the cost weighed on me every day. My health faltered. I skipped meals, lived on coffee and adrenaline. My reflection in the mirror became sharper, harder, like a blade honed too many times. Friends outside the company noticed. "You look exhausted, Valerie," they said. Exhausted was an understatement. The breaking point came during another pitch, this time to the Crestwood Group, a client whose portfolio could shift the market. I had prepared obsessively, certain this would prove I was still indispensable. But halfway through the meeting, one of the Crestwood executives leaned back and said, "We've heard troubling things about your leadership, Ms. Ray. Rumors of instability, internal conflicts. We're not sure this is the right partnership for us." The words landed like daggers. No matter how polished my presentation, the whispers had reached them first. We lost Crestwood that afternoon. When I returned to the office, Lorraine called me in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You're taking on too much, Valerie," she said quietly. "You're carrying the company's sins on your back and it's breaking you. I need you to pace yourself." I shook my head. "If I slow down, they'll bury this. They'll bury me." Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "Not if I don't let them." I wanted to believe her, but in the silence that followed, I wasn't sure if she was reassuring me or herself. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a minefield. Every step was measured, every glance around me suspicious. I couldn't tell who was waiting for me to fail and who was silently hoping I wouldn't. Clients continued to leave, not many, but enough to sting. Each departure arrived as a curt email or a sterile phone call, words crafted to sound professional but carrying an undertone of doubt. "We've decided to move in a different direction. We're consolidating our accounts." They never said the real reason, but I could hear it in their pauses: instability, rumors, Valerie Ray, our stock price dipped again. Analysts circled like vultures, their headlines sharp as knives. Internal conflict at Templeton Capital raises concerns. Transparency reforms spark investor anxiety. My name wasn't always mentioned, but it didn't have to be. Everyone knew who was driving the reforms. I felt the weight of hundreds of livelihoods pressing on me. Every dip in the stock chart looked like a knife aimed at the employees who had nothing to do with this war. Was I destroying more than I was saving? The loneliness grew sharper. Colleagues who used to greet me with warmth now passed with curt nods. Some avoided me altogether. I overheard one whisper, "She'll be gone by summer," as I stepped into the ladies' room. At night, my apartment felt less like a home and more like a bunker. I sat surrounded by papers and glowing screens, drowning in charts and timelines, searching for comfort in the numbers that never lied. My phone buzzed endlessly with messages I ignored. Friends, family, colleagues reaching out, I didn't answer. Silence had become both shield and prison. One evening, after another brutal day, I walked home through the rain. The city blurred in streaks of light on the pavement. A man bumped into me without apology, his umbrella clashing against my shoulder. For a moment, I thought of shouting, of letting out all the fury I had bottled inside. But the words died in my throat. I was too tired. When I reached my apartment, Tanya was waiting at the door. Her coat was soaked, her hair plastered to her face. "Why didn't you answer my messages?" she asked. I sighed. "Because I didn't have anything good to say." She stepped inside, dropped her bag, and pulled a folded document from her pocket. "Then let me say something for you." She spread the papers on my kitchen table. Performance reports, growth charts, client acquisitions in her division up 22%, my brow furrowed. "Tanya, what is this?" "Proof," she said simply. "While some clients leave, others are coming. They're choosing us because of what you're doing, because you've made this company different." I sank into a chair, staring at the numbers. They glowed like embers in the darkness. "And it's not just me," Tanya continued. "Zoe landed the Riverside Pension Fund last week. Rebecca's accounts are growing. Clients who care about integrity, who care about fairness, are seeking us out. You're not destroying this company, Valerie, you're rebuilding it." Her words cut through the fog in my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than exhaustion. Hope. Small, fragile, but alive. I looked at her. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I know what they're saying about you," Tanya said softly. "And I know what it feels like to doubt yourself. I almost quit last year because I thought I wasn't good enough. But it wasn't me, it was them, and you proved it. Don't let them break you now." My throat tightened. I wanted to argue, to insist the cost was too high. But instead, I whispered, "Thank you." She smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me, just keep going." After she left, I sat alone again, staring at the growth charts spread across my table. For the first time, the silence around me didn't feel like defeat. It felt like space. Space to breathe, space to plan. I realized then that the price of truth was steep. It cost me friends, security, comfort. It painted a target on my back so large I could feel its weight pressing into my skin, but it also bought something priceless. Trust. Real trust from people who mattered. Clients who believed in the new system. Colleagues who finally saw themselves reflected in a company that valued them. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony. The city lights shimmered in the rain, each one a tiny flicker of resilience. Yes, the price was high, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth paying. And as I stood there, I knew one thing for certain: the war was far from over. The days began to blur into each other. Meetings, reports, phone calls, long hours staring at glowing screens while the city outside cycled through dawn and dusk without me noticing. I lived on black coffee and half-eaten takeout. My reflection in the bathroom mirror grew sharper every morning, cheekbones carved by exhaustion, eyes ringed with shadows. And still, the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. People didn't just avoid me now, they openly questioned me. In a meeting about the new auditing system, one senior executive leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Not every discrepancy is corruption, Valerie. Sometimes numbers just get lost. Do you plan to interrogate all of us every time a decimal shifts?" The laughter that followed was sharp, brittle, and directed at me. I forced myself to stay calm. "This isn't about decimals. It's about patterns. It's about accountability." But the words felt heavy in my throat. Even as I said them, I could see the doubt in the room. Later that day, my inbox pinged with a message from a client we had courted for months. They were withdrawing. The reason was vague, wrapped in phrases like strategic shift and realignment, but I knew better. They had heard the rumors. They didn't want to tie themselves to a company whose internal war was splashed across whispers in every corner of the industry. The news spread fast. By the next morning, half the building knew. At lunch, I sat alone in the cafeteria. My tray of food sat untouched while the room buzzed around me. A group at the next table spoke in low voices, but I caught fragments. "Not worth the trouble. How long before she's gone?" I wanted to slam my fist down, to scream that I wasn't the villain here, that I hadn't created the corruption. I just refused to look away from it. But instead, I sat in silence. Because if I exploded, they would win. They'd point and say, "See, she's unstable. She can't handle it." So I swallowed the fire and let it burn inside me. The breaking point came with the Riverton account. It was supposed to be our saving grace, a multi-million-dollar contract that could restore investor confidence. I led the team preparing the pitch, pouring every shred of energy into it. Late nights, endless revisions, strategy sessions that stretched past midnight. By the time the day arrived, I felt like I had memorized every word, every number, every pause in the presentation. The morning of the pitch, I walked into the conference room with my team at my side. But the moment I began to speak, I felt it. Something was wrong. The executives from Riverton shifted in their seats, their eyes already cool, skeptical. They weren't here to be convinced. They were here to confirm what they had already decided. Halfway through, their lead partner raised a hand. "We've heard concerning things about your leadership, Ms. Ray. Internal instability, lawsuits, conflict. How can we trust your company to manage our assets if you can't even manage your own people?" The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Lawsuits, that was new. I glanced at my team. Their faces were pale, confused. We hadn't discussed lawsuits because there weren't any, not yet. I forced myself to answer, voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "We are building systems to ensure stability and integrity. Change can look chaotic from the outside, but it is necessary. What you've heard are distortions." But the damage was done. The meeting ended with polite handshakes and empty promises to reconsider. By the next morning, they too were gone. That night, Lorraine called me into her office. She didn't waste time. "We're under attack," she said flatly. "Competitors are reaching out to our clients, feeding them rumors. Lawsuits, instability, internal collapse. It's coordinated, and it's coming from people who used to be inside these walls." Her eyes locked onto mine. Noah had friends. Martin had allies. They're not just gone, they're fighting us from the outside, and they've decided you're the easiest target. My mouth went dry. "They want me destroyed." She nodded. "They want you discredited, because if they can make you look like the problem, everything you expose disappears with you." The weight of it sank into my bones. I wasn't fighting one man anymore. I wasn't even fighting one office. I was fighting an entire network of people who thrived in the shadows and wanted me silenced. I walked out of Lorraine's office that night with my head spinning. The city lights blurred around me. The rain was cold on my skin, but I barely felt it. This was bigger than me, bigger than Templeton Capital, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry it. The body keeps score. I'd heard that phrase before, but I didn't understand it until then. Weeks of 12-hour days, skipped meals, and sleepless nights began to catch up. My hands trembled when I typed. My vision blurred at odd times, numbers dancing across the screen. Coffee, once my fuel, turned sour in my stomach. One morning, as I walked into a meeting, the world tilted. The carpet swayed under my feet. I gripped the edge of the conference table to steady myself, forcing a smile while the directors filed in. No one seemed to notice, or maybe they did and chose to ignore it. That was the thing about this place. Weakness was invisible until it was fatal. The meeting was brutal. Questions hurled at me like stones. Why were clients leaving? Why had the stock dipped again? Why was morale so low? I answered with numbers, with logic, with the truth. But every word felt like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave. Their expressions never softened. By the end, I was drained, a hollow shell in a tailored suit. Afterward, I sat in my office staring at the city skyline. Lights blinked in the glass towers across the street, each one a tiny reminder that life went on for everyone else. For me, it felt like the walls were closing in. I thought of my mother again. I saw her sitting at the kitchen table years ago, her shoulders slumped, her hands shaking as she read the letter that ended her career. I remembered the way her voice broke when she said, "I have nothing left." I pressed my palms into my eyes, fighting tears I refused to let fall. Was I destined for the same ending? Had I fought this hard only to be broken the same way? The knock on my door startled me. It was a Manny from estate planning. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her presence calm but steady. "I heard what happened with Riverton," she said softly. I nodded, too tired for pretense. "We lost them, and maybe more to come. The board is sharpening their knives." She walked closer, her heels clicking against the floor, and set a folder on my desk. "Then you should see this." Inside were reports from her division. Client acquisitions up. Revenue steady, even climbing. I frowned. "I thought we were bleeding clients." "Some, yes," she said. "The ones who thrived on the old system, but others are coming, new clients, especially women with significant portfolios. They're choosing us because of what you're doing." Her eyes locked onto mine. "Valerie, you're not destroying this company, you're remaking it. Not everyone sees it yet, but they will." My throat tightened. I wanted to believe her, but doubt was a stubborn parasite. She leaned forward. "Do you know why I didn't leave last year?" "Because I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would finally stand up for us. And then you did. You're paying the price, yes, but you've also given us something we never had before, proof, hope." Her words sank deep, threading into the cracks of my exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faint flicker of strength returning. I closed the folder slowly, my fingers brushing the pages as if they might dissolve. "Thank you," I whispered. She shook her head. "Don't thank me, just don't give up. That's all any of us need from you." When she left, the silence in my office felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating, just quiet. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My body was still breaking. My mind was still battered. But somewhere beneath the rubble, the fire was still alive. The breaking point hadn't destroyed me, it had stripped me down to the core. And at the core, I found something I thought I had lost, the will to keep fighting. Because if I didn't, then all of this, all the evidence, all the sacrifices, all the women who had been silenced would vanish. And I refused to let that happen. I poured myself a glass of water, steadying my hands against the counter. The night outside was deep and dark, but the city lights sparkled like scattered embers. I knew the war wasn't over. If anything, it was about to escalate. And I was ready. It began with an envelope. Thick, official, stamped with the seal of the court. I found it waiting on my desk one Monday morning, a silent intruder among the ordinary clutter of memos and reports. My name was written across the front in sharp black letters. Inside was a lawsuit. Martin Hale was suing Templeton Capital. And me, personally, he accused me of manufacturing evidence, of orchestrating his dismissal in a vindictive campaign to destroy his career. He claimed damages of $3.8 million. I read the words once, twice, a third time. My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. It was absurd, outrageous, and yet terrifying, because in the world of corporate law, truth is not always what matters. Perception is, and Martin knew how to play perception like a violin. By noon, the news had spread across the building. Colleagues avoided my eyes in the hallway. Some whispered openly, maybe she did go too far. This could ruin us. Lorraine called me into her office. She held her copy of the lawsuit like it was a venomous snake. Our legal team is confident, she said. The evidence is solid. His case has no merit. But you need to understand, Valerie, this will not be quick or painless. His attorneys will drag you through the mud. They will question your motives, your character, even your sanity. Are you ready for that? I wanted to say yes. Instead, I swallowed hard and whispered, do I have a choice? She didn't answer. The depositions began 2 weeks later. I sat in a sterile room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a recorder on the table, lawyers flanking me like vultures. Martin sat across the room, his suit pressed, his smirk faint but unmistakable. His attorney leaned forward. Ms. Ray, why did you begin documenting your work so meticulously? Were you planning from the beginning to fabricate a case against Mr. Hale? I forced my voice steady. No. I began documenting because I understood how vulnerable employees are when authority is abused. I watched my mother lose her career because she had no proof. I refused to let that happen to me. They pressed harder. Isn't it true you blind copied company data to your personal account? Isn't that against policy? Yes, I said, but within the exception for personal work logs. I verified it with legal before I began. Every question was a trap, every answer a tightrope. At one point, Martin himself spoke. She was always ambitious, he said coolly. Always looking for ways to climb faster. I mentored her, I supported her, and this is how she repays me by inventing lies. The venom in his voice cut deep. For a split second, doubt flared in my chest. Could people believe him? Could the narrative twist that easily? That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the city. My phone buzzed with messages I ignored. My wine glass sat untouched. For the first time, I felt the cold shadow of defeat creeping toward me, and then I remembered something. The night before my first confrontation with Martin, I hadn't just saved my files. I had sent copies of everything, every report, every altered version, every system log to an encrypted third-party server. My own failsafe. A habit I'd developed after years of watching systems fail the people who trusted them. I hadn't told anyone, not even Lorraine. And suddenly I knew, this was my weapon, my ace in the hole. Martin thought he was dragging me into a battle of words and perception, but I had something stronger than words. I had proof that could not be erased, not by him, not by anyone. The plot twist wasn't that he had sued me. The plot twist was that he had already lost. The trial opened on a gray morning, rain streaking down the courthouse windows like veins on stone. The air inside smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. Reporters clustered in the hallway, their cameras flashing whenever Martin appeared, his smile perfectly rehearsed. He thrived on the attention. He looked every bit the respectable executive, polished, wounded, betrayed. And I, sitting at the defendant's table with sleepless eyes and clenched fists, was the perfect villain for his narrative. His attorney painted the picture he wanted, an ambitious young woman manipulating data to dethrone her mentor. They called it a betrayal, a vendetta, a fabrication. Every word was aimed not at the judge, but at the headlines waiting outside. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled as I held the papers. I didn't want this fight, I began, but I refused to let the same thing that destroyed my mother's career happen to me. I documented everything, not because I planned a vendetta, but because I knew what it felt like to be powerless. I could see the doubt in the judge's eyes, the skepticism in the gallery. Words weren't enough. Martin knew it. And for a moment, I feared he was right. That proof could be twisted, that perception could eclipse reality. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. My attorney rose and presented a flash drive. Your Honor, this contains a full archive of the data in question, verified by an independent third-party security firm. Ms. Ray submitted it to their servers months before Mr. Hale's termination. Every email, every altered file, every log entry, time-stamped, unalterable, encrypted. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. Is this true? The IT expert nodded. Yes, Your Honor, we've verified the integrity. The records match company servers exactly, down to the minute of alteration. It is impossible for Ms. Ray to have fabricated this. Martin's face drained of color. For the first time, the mask cracked. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted toward his lawyer, searching for an escape. But there was none. The evidence rolled out like a tide, relentless and undeniable. Logs showing his access, edits made under his credentials. Reports altered to diminish women's performance and inflate his proteges. Emails with his directives hidden in casual language. A pattern so clear it was damning. The courtroom shifted. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge's expression hardened. When Martin took the stand again, his voice shook. His confident narrative crumbled under the weight of facts he couldn't twist. His lawyer objected, grasped at straws, but it was useless. By the end of the day, the lawsuit he had filed against me turned into a noose around his own neck. Not only was his claim dismissed, but the judge ordered an investigation into his actions and potential charges of fraud. The headlines the next morning were nothing like he had hoped. Former executive exposed in sabotage scandal. Lawsuit backfires, evidence buries Hale. Valerie Ray's proof shakes corporate culture. I read them alone in my apartment, the papers spread across the table like a battlefield map after victory. And yet, it didn't feel like triumph. Not entirely. Because the cost was still there. The sleepless nights. The colleagues who had turned away. The parts of myself I had lost in the fire. But for the first time, I felt something deeper than survival. Vindication, not just for me, for Tanya, for Zoe, for Amani, for every woman who had been silenced. Later that week, Lorraine called me into her office. She stood at the window, the city's skyline stretched before her. When she turned, there was something softer in her eyes. You saved us, she said simply. But more than that, you changed us. The board knows it now. The clients see it. This company won't ever be the same. I nodded, though words felt inadequate. As I left her office, colleagues looked at me differently. Not with whispers, not with avoidance, with something closer to respect. The silent war wasn't over. There would always be shadows. But now they knew someone was watching. And as I stepped out into the sunlight, the city buzzing around me, I felt the weight lift just enough to breathe again. The truth had nearly broken me. But in the end, it was the very thing that set me free. I had thought Martin was finished with me. The day he was escorted out of the building, his face twisted with disbelief, I told myself that was the last time his shadow would cross my path. But men like Martin never disappear quietly. They linger like smoke in your lungs, leaving you gasping long after the fire is gone. It began with a letter, delivered to my office in a crisp envelope with the embossed seal of a law firm I had only ever seen in headlines. The firm was notorious for defending the indefensible. Oil spills, pharmaceutical cover-ups, collapsed hedge funds. Now they were representing Martin Hale. The letter accused me of professional misconduct, fabrication of evidence, malicious defamation, and wrongful interference in his career. He was suing the company for millions, and me personally, for reputational damages that could supposedly never be undone. When I finished reading, I realized I was gripping the page so tightly that my nails had left little half-moon cuts in the paper. For a long time, I couldn't move. The office was buzzing with end-of-day chatter outside my door, but inside, everything had gone silent. Arthur from legal came in half an hour later. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood in the doorway, his tie loose, his eyes tired. "Valerie, we're in for a war," he said. I wanted to laugh, but all that came out was a brittle sound, like glass cracking. "I thought we'd already fought it," I whispered. "This," Arthur said, finally lowering himself into the chair across from me, "was the skirmish. What's coming is the battle." And so it began. Depositions, pretrial hearings, endless exchanges of documents. They painted me as ruthless, ambitious, obsessed. They dug into my past, pulling out fragments I had long since buried. The jobs I left because I refused to compromise, the supervisors I had challenged, the projects I had derailed by asking questions that were too sharp. Martin himself showed up at some of the hearings. He looked older, thinner, but his arrogance had not diminished. He watched me with the cold satisfaction of a man who still believed he could bend reality around his will. One afternoon, during cross-examination, his lawyer leaned across the table and asked the question I had been expecting all along. "Ms. Ray, why did you feel it necessary to keep such obsessive records of your work? Most employees don't archive every email, every report, every timestamp. Were you planning all along to weaponize this information?" I met his eyes, then Martin's. Because I learned young that in systems built to protect men like him, truth without proof is worthless. The lawyer arched an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "My mother," I said. The words came slower than I intended, like stones dragged up from a riverbed. "She was a nurse. For 20 years she worked without a single complaint. Until one day she reported her supervisor for harassment. The next month her records showed sudden incompetence. Medications misplaced, charts filled with errors. None of it true. But she had no copies, no backup, no way to prove her innocence. She lost her job, her pension, her dignity. I promised myself I would never let that happen to me." The silence that followed was total. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering above the keys. Martin shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. It was in that silence that the twist arrived, the move I had been holding back. I leaned forward slightly. "And because of that, I didn't only keep my own records. I kept others too. Every anomaly, every discrepancy. Every time the numbers shifted against a woman in favor of a man, I archived it all. And I secured it all outside the company, in a system Martin cannot reach, no matter how much he pays his lawyers." Gasps rippled through the room. Martin's lawyer sputtered, objected, demanded the statement be stricken from the record. But the damage was done. The seed had been planted. This wasn't just my word against Martin's. This was a pattern, a system, and I had the receipts. From that point on, the case unraveled like a sweater pulled at the wrong thread. Martin's countersuits were dismissed, his appeals denied. The evidence was overwhelming, and worse, it was undeniable. He wasn't just a disgraced executive anymore. He was a symbol. Every headline carried his name next to words like manipulation, discrimination, fraud. 2 months later, Martin withdrew the lawsuit entirely. Officially, it was described as a settlement. Unofficially, he had lost. Utterly. Irrevocably, his career was over, but if I thought victory would bring relief, I was wrong. The day after the announcement, Lorraine called me into her office. She was seated behind her vast oak desk, fingers steepled, eyes sharp with something between approval and calculation. "You've carried this weight alone long enough," she said. "The board has decided to form an ethics and accountability committee. We want you to lead it, as a full member of the board." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something colder, a sense of stepping into the very lion's den I had been fighting against. At the next board meeting, the tension was thick enough to taste. Men in tailored suits shifted uncomfortably as I laid out my proposal, transparency not only internally but externally. Quarterly reports released to clients, investors, even regulators. No shadows, no sealed doors. The backlash was immediate. "Reckless," one director barked. "This is suicide," another sneered. "You'll drive us into the ground." I let them rage, let the room echo with their protests. Then I said, softly but clearly, "If we truly believe in our company's integrity, we have nothing to hide. Unless," I paused, letting the words hang like a blade, "we do." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. In that moment, I realized something. Martin's fall had not ended the war. It had only cleared the field for the real battle, the one against the culture that had enabled him in the first place. And I was standing at the front lines, whether I wanted to or not. The days after the board meeting stretched long and heavy. At first, I thought the silence was victory. Then I realized it was resistance taking a different shape. Whispers began in the hallways. I heard them when I passed a cluster of colleagues who fell quiet too quickly. Some said I had engineered the entire scandal to climb higher. Others said I was reckless, that I would sink the company with my obsession for exposure. The cruelest ones said I was dangerous, too dangerous to trust, too dangerous to follow. There were moments when I wondered if they were right. The first quarterly report went public, and almost immediately, 2 clients pulled their accounts. Our stock dipped. Analysts on television called us unstable. And once again, my name was dragged across headlines, this time paired with words like radical, risky, unpredictable. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the city's glow bleeding through the blinds. Had I destroyed the very thing I had fought to protect? And then, something shifted. 2 weeks later, we received a call from a foundation in Berlin. They were impressed by our transparency and wanted to invest, precisely because they believed in the principles we had published. Then came a pension fund in Canada, then a technology firm in Singapore. One after another, new clients arrived, each one citing not just our returns but our openness as the reason they had chosen us. For every customer we lost, 2 more came, carrying the weight of belief behind them. I walked the halls differently after that. The whispers didn't stop, but they began to sound weaker. I could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of those who had once dismissed me. Still, resistance lingered. In one board meeting, a director slammed his fist against the table and shouted that I was dismantling decades of carefully guarded privacy. "You'll ruin us," he hissed. "No," I said calmly. "I'm saving us. The world is changing. Companies that hide will fall. Companies that stand in the open will survive." Lorraine nodded almost imperceptibly, her gaze sharp as glass. She had thrown her weight behind me, but I knew even she was waiting to see if I would crack under the pressure. The climax came 6 months later when we hosted an international summit in Geneva. By then, the data was undeniable. Promotion rates for qualified women had risen dramatically, wage gaps had narrowed, employee retention was climbing. The system worked. When I stepped onto that stage, facing an audience of executives, journalists, regulators, and activists from around the world, my hands trembled only for a moment. Then I gripped the podium and began to speak. I told them about my mother. I told them about the silence of rooms where men conspired against women they called incompetent. I told them about how I had learned to save every scrap of evidence, because without proof, justice was just a story no one believed. And I told them about Martin. Not by name, he didn't deserve that, but as a symbol of what happens when power is left unchecked. The room was silent. Every face fixed on me, every breath held. "The greatest revenge," I said, my voice steady, "is not destroying a man. It is dismantling the system that allowed him to rise. It is changing the rules so that another like him will never rise again." The applause came like thunder. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to capture the words. But I didn't feel the triumph of a conqueror. I felt something cleaner, something freer. That night, I stood alone on the balcony of my hotel, the lake below reflecting the lights of the city. I thought of my mother's tired hands. I thought of the colleagues who had come to me with trembling voices, asking if I believed them. I thought of the boardroom where Martin once sat, so certain he would always win. And I realized I wasn't fighting him anymore. I wasn't even fighting the men who still whispered behind closed doors. I was fighting for the silence to break, for truth to echo loud enough that no one could ignore it again. The war was never just mine. It belonged to every woman who had been told to sit down, to keep quiet, to accept less. As I looked out across the water, the city shimmering like a constellation fallen to earth, I felt it at last. Not vengeance, not victory, but freedom. Freedom and the unshakable certainty that this time, the walls were not going to rise again.